how many weeks ago, right? But we did quite a few days in Israel, and it was a lot of fun. And so for those of you who actually met me in Israel, then this is, there's no need for me to really introduce myself. But for those of you who don't know me, then my name is Shai. Really translates in Hebrew as a gift. That's my mother's issue. I mean, she thought I was a gift when I was born, and very quickly she understood that's not the case, But I'm a professional tour guide. That's what I do for a living. I guide groups in Israel as they come to Israel, and they enjoy walking around Israel with me as we explore the sites together. So what we're about to do is basically start talking about a specific subject. As Pastor said, we're going to start talking about the idea of Shabbat. What is Shabbat? What is it good for? Why do we have it? A lot of people see Shabbat as a very negative thing. So what we want to do is maybe get out of the way a bit and just kind of go through what this means. So this is just the headline, Shabbat, as I said. And what I've learned over time is basically that what we want to do is get some of the things out of the way, right? So my name is Shai. I'm the owner of Ecological Tourism, also known as Shai Tourist. And I've been doing this for the last 6 years or so. I guide all sorts of groups, Christians, Jews, non-affiliated, evangelicals, Catholics, Orthodox, all the works. It all comes down into one big hat, and whatever comes out, I'm happy to work with it. And over time, I've gotten really comfortable with all sorts of different traditions. But as I said to the group that came to Israel, and I say this to everybody, if I offend you at any point, trust me, I didn't mean to. I use all sorts of different terminologies as I speak, sometimes assuming things, but most of the times I don't assume anything. So if anything, assume that I meant to use that terminology as a complicated aspect and not just to offend people. So if I'm not calling the Pope the Pope or something of sort, don't take offense. I'm probably using that a different terminology just so I use something out of the world of context that we're comfortable with. So this is me. That's who I am. That's my new logo, by the way. This is all changed. Anybody has my business card knows that it has changed. And we can move on. So what is Shabbat, right? I mean, let's start with the actual basic concept. What is Shabbat to begin with? So we got two ways to approach Shabbat. Like with any religious aspect, especially when you're dealing with Judaism and Christianity, what you want to do is basically start with the basis. So the scripture concept.
I gave an introduction.
Where does it appear in scripture? And on the other hand, what does it mean today from our traditional standpoint?
But Jim Paul already said, hi, Haggerty's. So he saw us. He saw me. And it looks like
we may.
Sorry, hold a second.
Moves on to understanding people's traditions. That's basically what we want to do, right? So let's move to the next slide, if that's all right. Shabbat is a verb that I think most people don't understand. What this is saying in Hebrew is Shabbat Shalom. And you can see that translation in English, that's the traditional blessing. Shabbat means the day of the Sabbath, or the seventh day of the week, what is known in English as Saturday. But Shalom translates as a variety of different things. Peace, hello, goodbye. In this case, it means peace. So in other words, the true translation of Shabbat Shalom would be a peaceful Sabbath. And I think this is probably the most common picture that will be shown in respect to Shabbat. It has all the best elements of the Shabbat meal in it. And this is what it starts with, the 2 candles, the challah bread, which is the woven piece of bread that we traditionally use, and the goblet or the cup or the chalice of the wine. And this is something that comes from the most basic blessings of the Shabbat tradition. So let's move ahead one, if that's all right, Pastor.
Yeah, let me go ahead and pause you for 1 second, Shai. All right, I'm going to mute everyone and try to go back and unmute Shai. Okay, Shai, try to unmute yourself here.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Is that all right? Can everybody hear me?
All right, we're good now. All right.
All right. So the next slide that you can see, this one exactly. The next one, if you will. I'm sorry, the previous one, if you will.
Sorry.
We're just skipping ahead. One more. Thank you. So this is the most basic verse that deals with the Sabbath. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to read it for a second in Hebrew. I don't think many people have heard it in Hebrew. And then the translation is right in front of you. You can actually read it for yourself, but I'm going to read the same. ויחולו השמיים והארץ, וכל צבאם, ויכל אלוהים ויכל אלוהים ביום השביעי מלאכתו אשר עשה, וישבות ביום השביעי מכל מלאכתו אשר עשה, ויברך אלוהים את יום השביעי ויקדש אותו, כי בו שבת מכל מלאכתו אשר ברא אלוהים לעשות. The word that is basically at the bottom, you can't see my marker, but if you look at the Hebrew text, third line from the bottom, leftmost word is what it says Shabbat. And the verb that is used to describe what God does is translated in a very interesting way into the English translation. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because in it he rested from all his work which God in creating has done. It's translated as rested. That's not an accurate translation. The rested portion, and it's not wrong, I mean, it's one of the ways you can translate the verb, but the actual verb means to go on strike. It is an absolute stop of everything. We talk a lot about the 7 days of creation, right? We have in the book of Genesis, starting from the very first, verse, we start talking about God creating the world, the physical world upon which we will walk by separating the earth from the heavens, separating the waters, creating the trees, creating the plants, creating the animals. And one of the last things he's done is create human life, basically to walk on this earth, which is us, the creation of the world. But we always associate the creation of the world with 7 days, which is the basis of the concept of our week. We have Sunday, Monday, from a Jewish perspective, right? From a Christian perspective, the way you count the week might be a little bit different. But from a Jewish perspective, it would be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, which is understood as Sabbath. Sabbath means it goes on strike. That's the place in time which God stopped everything. Last point of creation is Friday. On Friday Eve, on Friday night, creation ceased. And the next morning, if you will, when the sun goes up again, right? There is absolutely no creation that goes along again. Moreover, creation would be absolutely and fundamentally forbidden as an honorary thing towards what God did, because God himself did not create anything on the Sabbath, and therefore creation is almost disallowed on the Sabbath. There's only one concept of creation that is allowed on the Sabbath, and that is the creation of life. I don't know if you're familiar with this or you know this, but there's only one thing that is actually not just allowed, but encouraged in the Jewish tradition, and that is to create life. I don't need to go into the specifics. I assume everybody understands what I mean by this one. But on the Sabbath, other than that, it's important to understand just where this concept of not doing anything comes from, and that's from the verse itself. It says that God himself went on strike to some degree, or basically just stopped creating anything else, and that's where this whole idea of Shabbat starts, right? If you will, let's move to the next one, please. So when we come to the Sabbath, the marking of the Sabbath today starts with the fact that we would light the candles. Now, you can see two beautiful candles, very decorated, golden or whatever this would be, candles already lit. These candles are to be seen only, they're not to be used. This flame is disallowed to be used. It is a symbolic idea. You light the candles, and the candles are supposed to be extinguished on their own. The wax will melt and will be collected on these candelabras, or on a tablecloth, or on a plate, or whatever it is. But these are to be seen only. They are not allowed to be used whatsoever. Using these candles for anything but seeing them, even to use them for reading, would be basically a defilement of the concept of Shabbat. Now, but everything in Judaism has symbolism to it. And when you understand the symbolism of the factor that we're talking about, then you understand better where the source of things is coming to. And I promise you, I'm not going through this just to explain the Jewish tradition. I'm actually going through this because I want to get to some degree to where these two traditions, when I say the two traditions, I mean Judaism and Christianity, actually align to some degree on something. So let's just go through this. I have here two verses in Hebrew. You can see them. They're both in somewhat reddish. One is high and the other one is lower. I'm just going to read them to you.
Let me stay there.
Yes, thank you. Shamor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. And the second one is Zechor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. And they translate as keep the Sabbath to sanctify it. That's the first one. And the second one is remember the Sabbath to sanctify it. So you can see at the bottom, keep versus remember. They both appear in the book of Exodus. And they are basically commandments, not commandments the way the 10 Commandments, but a commandment to be observed that was given in the book of Exodus. But they appear twice. And it's one of the only things in the entire Jewish Bible, when I say Jewish Bible, I mean the 5 first books, that a commandment is given twice, but it's not repeated the same, that the verb is changed. So the verb that is used here, we have one, which is keep, the other one, which is remember. For that concept, as a symbolic idea, we light 2 candles rather than 1. So we originally start with 2 candles because we want to mark the fact that there are 2 specific passages, which one of them is different than the other. They mean something totally different. One, observe the Sabbath. Keep the Sabbath means observe it. What does it mean to observe it? Don't do anything. Don't create. Later on, the Jewish tradition will associate that with the idea of no work to be done, right? That's coming from the temple times. The other one is to remember the Sabbath. Now, what does it mean to remember the Sabbath? That's a big question, right? Most people don't realize it, but if you don't make the Sabbath, it is not a Sabbath. It is just a Saturday. And there's a very famous story about this in Jewish culture about 2 rabbis that lived about 1800 years ago that decide that they're going to conduct the Sabbath on a Tuesday. And they go ahead with it. And they actually do everything the same. They refrain from work. They keep the Sabbath. They don't do anything that is disallowed. And they do everything that's supposed to be. They light the candles, they bless the bread, they bless the wine, they pray as is expected, they dress up for it, they make it a sacred day on a Tuesday on purpose. And Wednesday, so Tuesday was the Friday evening, if you will, and Wednesday became the Sabbath. At the end of the Wednesday, they realize that it was exactly the same as going through the Sabbath. And they go to their rabbi, which is a very famous rabbi at the time, and they say to him, Rabbi, we have a very big dilemma because we just realized that if you conducted the Sabbath on a Tuesday, the Tuesday would be just the same as if it was on a Saturday. So why do we have to do it on a Saturday? And you know what he says to them? He says, you're right, don't tell everybody. Because that's very true. We're not, and if you look at it from a different perspective, I lived in the States for 4 to 5 years, and there were many times in which a Jewish holiday would come along. I wouldn't even remember it was a Jewish holiday, or the Sabbath would come along, and it was just another day for me. It was just a Saturday. It didn't mean anything. Nobody around me was doing anything to that extent. Bottom line of what I'm trying to say is basically, if you do not remember and you do not make it so, then it is nothing. It is just another day. And you can take that and you can add it into the concept of what a Sunday is. It's basically the same idea. A Sunday could be just another regular day. You could go to work, you could do everything regular, or it could be a special day for you. So this is the concept. That's what starts. This initiates, this moves the Sabbath forward. You mark the fact that this is about to become a very special day by lighting the candles. Originally, everybody could have lit the candles, but today it has become more of a function of the women. The women gather in the household, and they are the ones who light the candles. There's a ceremony today that is conducted by the women, and that's not very common. In the Jewish tradition and many other traditions, a lot of the roles of leadership were originally associated with the male concept. And over time, women or females lost the leadership role in a lot of these ceremonies. This is one of those that is held in regard, especially for women, by women. And it's something that is very much regarded in high level of prestige to some degree. This is their role. Now, if you would ask to move to the next one, the ceremony that would end Shabbat is called Havdalah. Havdalah comes from another Jewish tradition. It comes from Lehavdil ben Kodesh Lechol, to separate or distinguish between holy and mundane. If you look at the candle that is burning in front of you on the screen, you can see that it is made up by different wicks that were joined. This is a celebratory candle of Havdalah. But originally what you would do in the old traditions, you would let the Shabbat candles, if you remember there were 2, basically melt completely on a table, on a piece of plate or something of sort, and then their original wicks would mix together. So at the end of Shabbat, you would take whatever was there, like a blob of wax with 2 molten wicks, and you would use that as the Havdalah ceremony, where you distinguish between the sacred times of Shabbat, which are the holy times, and the regular times. And if you look at the symbolic usage of the color in the background here, which is black, that's a purposeful choice, because the lighting of the candles at the beginning of Shabbat is understood as a joyous moment. You finally arrived to Shabbat, right? You waited all week long to come to Shabbat, and you finally came to Shabbat, and now at the end of Shabbat, this is a mourning process. It is not a celebratory process. It is a time of mourning. What are you mourning? You're mourning the fact that Shabbat is over. So it already gives you an idea of what is the concept of Shabbat in the Jewish tradition. Shabbat is one of the most fundamental, important rituals or ceremonies in the Jewish tradition. To be realistic on this one, one of the most severe punishments in Jewish tradition is reserved for people who do not keep the Sabbath from a Jewish perspective. The punishment that would be given to them by God is called krat, which translates as the concept of separating one's soul from the physical body, which means that from a Jewish perspective, a person who does not observe the Sabbath, their punishment would be that their soul will be separated from their body, and when they die, there is no option of resurrection. That's a massive, when you think about it, it's the most severe punishment given ever in Jewish tradition. If you will, Pastor, move to the next one, please.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Apologize. Another very basic concept of Jewish tradition is the challah. The challah is the woven bread that is used on the Saturday evening, on the Friday evening, on the Sabbath Eve. And as you can see, we have two of them here. This is another symbolic idea. This comes from basically from the book of Exodus as well. As the Israelites cross the desert, God is giving them manna. They find the manna outside their tents every morning, and they are told explicitly every morning never to gather more than one. If they do gather more than one, they will find that the second one, the third one, the fourth one they gathered go rotten, they spoil. Only the first one is actually preserved for them for eating. Why? Because it's a matter of trust. You need to trust in God fully to supply everything you need for the next day. But there's only one day in the week in which they're allowed to gather two, and that is the Friday. In that case, the manna will not get spoiled because the Saturday is not a day in which they're supposed to go scavenging for food. And so the usage of two challahs on the Shabbat table is symbolic to the two pieces of manna given on Friday morning to keep you throughout the Shabbat. If you look at the way the bread is woven, it's a symbolic concept of the people of Israel. As the tribes, the 12 tribes were woven into one, into a people. That's one of the symbolisms. And this is also symbolic to the destruction of the temple. During the temple time, there were 12 loaves of challah placed on the altar towards the Sabbath for the 12 tribes. As there is no temple, some of the rituals of the temple times were moved into a household, into a Shabbat dinner, and this is one of them. So this is the challah. It's a very, very important piece of the ceremony and will have very significant meaning when we actually compare this with the Passover meal. And we can move to the next one, please. So I purposely chose this particular image for this because various churches regard the idea of wine in various ways. Some churches believe that wine should not be taken at all. Others are completely fine with it. And so in an attempt not to make it the center of the piece, you see a glass chalice or a glass bottle on the left side of the piece, but you can see a very nice chalice in the middle. And what you can also see is that the same challahs that we just talked about actually covered by this silk sheet. Do you see that? Or silk covering. When you look at the Bible, in the Bible, it says the 7 species of grain and fruit that this land will be blessed with. And it goes through wheat and barley at the beginning, and then it goes through the other 5 types of fruit that the land will be given. It goes through grape and pomegranate and fig and olive oil and honey, which is interpreted as dates. And basically the barley and wheat, which are the more basic concepts of food in this area, especially in the Middle East thousands of years ago, are mentioned first. But in the Jewish tradition, you bless the wine first. You start the Shabbat meal by actually blessing over the wine. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher קידשנו ושותף וציוונו על שתיית יין של שבת. This is hamotzi pri hagefen. This is a very interesting concept. You bless the wine first, but you have a very significant problem with this because, well, the wheat actually is mentioned in the text first. So how do you go about blessing the grape before the wheat if the wheat was mentioned first? You cover the wheat. In the Jewish tradition, what we've done over time is we cover the wheat, we cover the bread, so it doesn't show. You don't see it. And everybody plays as if they don't know it's there. We all come into the Shabbat table. Everybody knows that there's challah underneath that table mat or whatever it is. And we'll look at it. We'll know it's there, but we don't see it. And so since we don't see it, we bless the wine first. And then after we've done blessing the wine, we make the blessing for the bread. Blessed are you, God, created the world, who has given us the bread, given us bread from the earth. And all of a sudden, poof, we just noticed that there's bread there. Why is this important? I'm going through all these traditional blessings of the Sabbath, and you got to be wondering to yourself, why is this important to me? I mean, honestly, what do I care about all this? The truth is that when you look at this, this is the basis of the concept of Shabbat. The candles, both the beginning and at the end of Shabbat, the bread, which is the Challah, which should be mentioned first, but actually moves to second, and the wine, which is the fruit of the grape, are the most basic aspects of Shabbat. There are additional concepts, right? The blessing of the children, prayer, and so forth and so on, cleansing one's hands, yada, 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 it all comes into it and it all has significance. But those are the most basic, most important things of this particular meal. We can move forward if that's okay.
Okay. Can I stop you for 1 second there, Shai?
Yes, please, sir.
So those of you who went on our trip, when we had Shabbat in the homes of people, we had 2 different groups that did that. You know, we specifically, I'm trying to remember I can't remember seeing the candles, but they probably were there, just not as visible. But I do remember the washing of the hands, the blessing of the children. Those were all part of the, now, are those things just that have evolved through history? Are those modern practices, or have they always been there?
Well, we're about to dive into where traditions developed from when we compare this with what happened here 2,000 years ago, right? So we're about to start answering that question. But in regards to why you didn't see the candles, we showed up to that particular dinner after the Sabbath has already started. We showed up after evening, after night has descended, if you will. There were no more, the sun was out, there were stars in the skies. So technically speaking, night has begun, which means that the Sabbath has begun. We showed up too late. You can light the candles only before the Sabbath begins, which means you're not allowed to create a new flame once the Sabbath started. So the candles would have been there. They would have been on a side table or in the kitchen. They would have been moved out of the way so nobody extinguished them by mistake, but they were lit before you came. They wouldn't have lit them especially for you. That would have been a violation of their Shabbat practice. And this was not, this was not a show. I mean, they actually observed the Sabbath. So that's why you don't remember the candles probably. And some of you are saying on the chat group right now that they don't remember seeing candles. That's very true, because it was not part of what you saw. But if you remember the booklet you were given, for those of you who actually kept the booklet, if you scroll through the booklet, you'll see that the candles are mentioned as part of the practices on Shabbat. And if it's all right for me to throw somebody on the bus here, I received emails from some participants of this group towards Passover, and a certain participant whose name starts with Michelle sent me a whole and you can see that they actually lit the candles. So this is really cool. I mean, they actually participate in the traditions. So if you don't mind, I'll get to the traditions and how they develop in a second. But what we went through right now was the modern day traditions. As I mentioned, some of them have to do with the destruction of the temple. That happened at the year 70 AD, which means that by this point, we're 42,000 years ago, but past the point in time which Jesus was walking around in Jerusalem. So let's just move on, if you will, and I'll answer those questions as we go.
Okay, good.
When you're dealing with Shabbat, Shabbat is the source of the holiday meal for Passover. That's basically what it comes down to. So we just celebrated the holiday of Passover on my end. And, it was a very challenging Passover, like we're doing right now, Zoom. We had to do everything simultaneously. We imagine singing holiday songs through Zoom with all sorts of different craziness going on. I mean, this is not exactly the ideal situation, to say the least. There are things that you're supposed to pass to one another. So it was hysterical to see how we did this. But, there's a positive to everything, because what we really could do, we had 2 Zoom sessions on at the same time. And for the first time in history, we celebrated Passover both with my family and with my wife's family. So, it's one to everything. But let's go through Passover and see how this relates. So if we can move to the next one, that would be great. There we go. So you remember the challah we just talked about, right? The challah is leavened bread. That means that you made the dough and you allowed it to rise, and you waited for it to rise significantly, and then you put it into the oven and you let it bake, or bake challah. The other one is the matzah. You guys are familiar with the matzah, but most times when you look at the matzah, that's on the left side of your screen, what you probably know is square-looking matzah. Square-looking matzah is factory made. Circle matzah or circular matzah is the traditional way the matzah should be done. And basically what it means, this is the unleavened bread. Now, why do we have the unleavened bread? I know which community I'm probably speaking to, so my guess would be all of you know the answer to this, but let's say you didn't. I'm explaining this to people who don't. When the Israelites escaped the Egyptian enslavement during the Pharaohite period, when Moses leads the people of Israel out of Egypt, they have a very short window of opportunity. God's angel on the 10th plague, on the 10th destruction on the Egyptians, goes from house to house. And if the house was not marked with the blood of the sacrificial lamb, then he knew that this was the house of an Egyptian, and the firstborn is killed by God's angel. So all the firstborns of Egypt, all the firstborns of the Pharaohite kingdom are killed on that particular night, murdered, if you will, or killed by God's angel. And for that few hours in which the Egyptians are very, very much baffled and scared by the situation, the Israelites are getting prepared for escape from Egypt. And as they're doing this, they have to make some sort of a, getaway kind of meal to take with them. They don't have time to wait for the dough to rise. And so what they do is they take the dough that they just made, they put it straight into the ovens onto hot plates, and they create these unleavened pieces of bread, which nowadays we know as matzah. From the matzah will come the very famous dish of matzah ball soup, right? What is matzah ball soup? You take a matzah, right, which is basically the huge cracker that you see in front of you. You break it into smithereens, so it becomes almost like matzah dust. And then you mix it with liquids so that you can create a ball out of it, and you put it in soup. That's basically what it means. So all those fragments of matzah basically soak up or soup up, or I don't know, they drink all the juice of the soup, and they have this wonderful flavor to them, right? That's matzah ball soup, right? Basically, it's a smashed cracker in the shape of a bowl. That's what it comes down to. May I ask you to move to the next slide, Pastor? Thank you. Now, this is the funniest thing in the world, right? Not every community uses what we're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen. I have the same matzah, but now I'm comparing it to something completely different. It looks like a wafer, and what it has on it is an imprint of a cross with Jesus on it, and it has 4 letters, 2 on either side. It says INRI, stands for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. I is Yeshua, which is Jesus. N is Nazarene of Nazareth. R is Rex, King, and I is the Jews, Judean. So this is what some groups, some communities would use as a communion/mass wafer. Others would use just broken matzah. For those of you who came to Israel, if you remember, we went to the Golden Tomb. We had the opportunity of having communion at the Golden Tomb. When we had communion at the Golden Tomb, you used broken up pieces of matzah. They had no distinguished shape. They were just basically somebody took a matzah, a square one that comes from a factory, broke it into smaller pieces. Each one of you got a piece of matzah. Because when it comes down to it, Jesus sits at the Passover meal, which we traditionally call the Last Supper. And he says to the disciples to drink from the wine, right, as is conducted on every Sabbath feast. And then he says to them to eat from the bread, as is conducted on any Sabbath feast. But the difference is going to be that instead of bread, what they're going to use is unleavened bread. Why? Because then the process of the holiday of Passover. So they're using matzah. And they're using probably circular matzah like we have on the screen right now, not the square matzah that we know from the factories, and not the nice, beautiful, really decorative wafers that we see on the right. They're basically just eating pieces of matzah. Now, he says to them, drink from the wine and eat from the bread, right? And that's what they're doing because that's the tradition of the Passover meal or of the Sabbath meal. That's basically what this comes down to. But let's get back to that, if that's all right, in a few minutes. We can move to the next one. What did Shabbat look like 2,000 years ago? Because it obviously didn't look like what we have today. Today, you go into somebody's home for Shabbat, they're going to have chicken, they're going to have beef, they're going to have rice, they're going to have vegetables, they're going to have beautiful challah, some of it sweet, some of it not so sweet. They're going to have really nice wine. They're going to be dressed in the best of their clothing, which is white, right? And stuff of the sort. And all the house is going to be clean. Everything is going to be immaculate. And, to be honest with you, that's not Shabbat 2,000 years ago. So what is Shabbat 2,000 years ago? There are some aspects of Shabbat 2,000 years ago that were there, even when, things were not as comfortable. One of the most interesting factors, and this is something we actually saw when we went to Israel. If you look at the right side of the screen, it has a piece of rock that has something basically chiseled into it. And what it says on it in Hebrew is lebeit hatki'ah lehach. Translates as to the house of the blowing. And the beginning of the last word is to describe, to pronounce, to declare. And what it translates into, this is a cornerstone that fell from the top of the Temple Mount, or the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount, when the Romans destroyed the temple. We walked in the Davidson Center. We walked on the Pilgrim's Road. We saw this stone in person. This is a replica that we're seeing in front of us, but we stood where it fell. And for those of you that were there, I mentioned a few things about this whole area. This is one of my favorite sites in all of Israel, this particular corner. But what you see on the left-hand side of the screen is a replica of what this would have looked like 2,000 years ago. This is basically the top of the corner of the Temple Mount in the southwestern area. What we see is a Levite holding a shofar. This is not accurate in any kind of way because it seems like this shofar is made of gold. It wouldn't have been. It would have been a natural animal horn, which in this case is straight. And this shofar, by the way, shofar is the only naturally formed musical instrument in the world. A horn will fall off an animal, naturally. Insects will hollow it out, and then you will get a horn that you can blow through. So the Levite used to blow from the top of the Temple Mount 6 times. Sorry, 6 times. Sorry about that. First one is to remind everybody working in the fields far away that they have to start making their way into Jerusalem because the Sabbath is about to come. Why are they supposed to come into Jerusalem? Because no work to be done. Second one, stall owners, shop owners, money changers, and I'm purposefully mentioning the money changers, end your business, close your shops, go home, Shabbat is about to start. Third one, women at home. No offense to anybody at home, right? That's not me. 2,000 years ago, the cooking was mainly done by the women. I think I can attest to the fact that in my personal house, cooking is still mostly done by the women, but in many other places, it's not necessarily the case. So no offense meant. But women, stop your cooking. Shabbat is about to start. Why stop your cooking? Because that's creation. Why close your shops? Because that's work. Why go back from the fields? Because that's work, right? And those were the 3 times in which they were basically telling people Shabbat is about to start. And then there would have been a section or a time in between, and then 3 more blowings in rapid succession, which would mark the fact that Shabbat has in fact started. Nothing more is to be done. Now, most people thinking about Shabbat automatically associate Shabbat with things that you're not allowed to do. Why? Because that's what most of us know. I mean, growing up in Israel, I can attest to the fact that today, no public transportation in Israel. Most shops will be closed on Shabbat. Most businesses will be closed on Shabbat. You're not supposed to drive your car. When I was growing up, some people would frown upon you towards the fact that you were driving your car on Shabbat. So today we're a lot more, developed, modernized, whatever you want to call it, open-minded. Things are not so, black and white. It's very gray, but it used to be a lot more harsh. 2,000 years ago, one of the basic ideas was to observe the Sabbath. And I'm going back to one of the previous original slides, if you remember. Remember the Sabbath and observe the Sabbath. Those are 2 of the most basic ideas. 1, remember the fact that this is the Saturday. And if you didn't, we're going to help you by blowing the shofar. 2, actually observe it. And if you can't do it for yourself, we're going to make you, right? If you work on Shabbat 2,000 years ago, you're not frowned upon. This is a huge offense. It could be met with a punishment of death for violating the Shabbat 2,000 years ago. That's a huge offense against the Jewish tradition. And if you remember, for those who traveled within Israel, and for those who don't, I'm repeating this purposefully, a Roman historian writes 2,000 years ago that this land is known for 3 things. 1, a day in the week in which no work is done. 2, a body of water in which all objects float, right? 3, a temple in which there's no sculpture or painting of God. Those are the 2 main things. But remember the first one, a day of the week in which no work is done. 2,000 years ago, no work is conducted in Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Remember and keep the Sabbath. That's the most basic things. What else do we know about the Sabbath 2,000 years ago? We know there was the blessing of the wine, and we know there was the blessing of the bread. How do I know that? Open the Jewish text to talk about ancient times, and you will see it's mentioned. Open the Jewish text to talk about the concept of keeping Shabbat. You will find numerous ones. You'll see all sorts of different mentionings. Most importantly, though, from your perspective, open the Gospels, read about the Last Supper, and you can attest to the fact that Jesus himself is conducting the Sabbath concepts on the Passover Meal, which is to bless over the wine and bless over the bread, right? He uses it for a different concept, drink from the wine, for this is my blood, eat from the bread, for this is my body. That's a different idea. He's associating with this new meaning, right? That's a different thing. But he is following the Jewish testament of what you're supposed to do on Shabbat. If we can move to the next one, that would be fantastic. So this is funny. I found this online, and I love this because it looks like the table of elements, right? I love this. But it's actually the 39 melachos. That's what it says in Hebrew, which is actually Yiddish, translates as jobs, which are not allowed to be conducted on the Sabbath. So if you really want to zoom in kind of and try to see what it says, don't worry about it. You can actually see the recording later. But it says here, it goes through choresh, zorea, kotzer, ma'amir, dush, zorea, v'chol. It goes through all the different occupations that are not allowed. So you're not allowed to plow your land. You're not allowed to sow your land. You're not allowed to reap your land. You're not allowed to gather. It goes through different categories, right? So you're not allowed to weave. You're not allowed to type. To tie a knot, you're not allowed to write, you're not allowed to erase, you're not allowed to make a fire, you're not allowed to extinguish a fire, and so forth and so on. It all goes into it. So there are 39 jobs or performances that are not allowed. And where do we get this originally? From the construction of the temple. During the time of the construction of the Temple of Solomon, the certain things that are going to be used for the construction of the temple, or during the time of the construction of the temple during Solomon's time, that are forbidden from being done on the Sabbath, and this is clearly mentioned in the Bible, what is not allowed to be done on the Sabbath during the construction of Solomon's temple. So already know that there's a very serious regard of the Shabbos, not even in Jesus' time, 1,000 years prior to Jesus' time. All these specific occupations or functions are mentioned in the Bible in respect to what you're not allowed to do on the Sabbath. Now, Jewish tradition is very interesting. Over time, we interpret, we add. Why do we add? Because the rabbinical movement, which is what we would have considered 2,000 years ago, the Pharisees, right, the followers of the text and not the followers of the Jewish leadership of the Sadducees, they look at the text and they interpret it. If it says in the Bible that you shouldn't eat a goat in its mother's milk, right, it's very clear, by the way, written in the Bible, you should not eat a goat that was cooked in its mother's milk. Why is it mentioned in the Bible? Because there were people around the Israelites that were actually doing this. And it was considered very cruel. And so they say very clearly, do not eat a goat in its mother's milk. But the Jewish tradition will say, so no goats in any milk. I might get this wrong. I might get the wrong milk. I might not understand that this is the goat's milk. I don't want to take a chance. So no goat in no milk. You know what? I don't even know if it's the right meat. No meat in no milk. Easiest way to deal with it. And over time, this will translate into the fact that today, very observant Jews would say, you need to wait 4 hours between the consumption of meat and the consumption of dairy. All right? So Jewish tradition over time goes away and away and away from the commandments. Today, many functions are disallowed on Shabbat, but originally these are the original 39. Does it mention in any of these healing? Not a single time. Now, for those of you who wandered with me in Israel, you remember that when we went to a place called Bethesda, we talked about the idea of Jesus healing the lame on the Sabbath, and why it would have been so infuriating for the guards of the temple when they saw the man carrying his mat. And that's a good question. That comes from Jewish interpretation, not the Jewish text. All right? We can move forward if that's all right. So for many people, the idea of Shabbat is associated with one thing, if more than anything else, and that is the what I cannot do. All right? Most people are unaware or do not remember or just choose to disregard the fact one of the biggest aspects of Shabbat is actually what's straight in front of us. It says that oneg Shabbat, right? That's what and it translates into the pleasure. Oneg means pleasure. What is the greatest pleasure in our lives? It is one's family. God creates the world in 6 days, and on the 7th, he rests. And he takes pleasure in his creation. That's one interpretation. That's one way to perceive it. It's a very romantic, if you will, understanding of the text. On the 7th day, God rested, not because he needed to. God is, all power. He can do whatever he wants. He thinks, and the world is created. He says a word, and the skies are separate from the waters below, from the oceans. God can do whatever he wants. He doesn't need a break, realistically speaking. Who needs a break? We do. Why do we need a break? Because otherwise, how would we appreciate everything that we've been able to create, right? We are just people. We work 6 days a week. Well, actually in Israel, we work 6 days a week. In the States, I think we work 5 days a week, if I remember this correctly. But we work the majority of the week, right? We work Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, half of Friday, and then we come to the half of Friday, and all of a sudden we get a break. It's a wonderful break in Jewish tradition. There's a moment in which you're allowed to appreciate the true blessings that you were given with. A time in which you don't have to do anything. You don't have to wake up early. You don't have to go to work. You don't have to conserve your food. You don't have to eat fast, right? You don't have to eat fast because you have to get off break to go back to doing what it is that you're doing. You get to appreciate and enjoy the time you have with your family. How many times we go through a week, and as we go through the week, we wake up at 6 a.m. I'm attesting to myself, by the way. Before Corona, for this whole COVID-19 issue, I used to wake up at 5:30 in the morning. I'd drive to Jerusalem. I would be in Jerusalem hopefully by 7:30. Then I would get out of my car, park it, go to the Jaffa Gate, and I would probably start a tour by 8:30 in the morning, or to the hotel in which the group is staying. And I would finish my workday guiding 5 or 6 p.m., get back in my car, drive back home, get home at 7:30 or 8 in the evening. My girls are 3.5 years old. They awake at 7 and they go to sleep at 7:30, which means that I missed them when I woke up and I missed them when I came back home. I could have a whole week in which I saw none of this, none of my family. And if I was staying with a group outside, because in my field, I'm staying in hotels a lot of times, it could be sometimes that I don't see my family for 2 weeks. And all of a sudden I come home and what do I have? I have this blessed moment in which I can appreciate what it is that I'm working for. Remember what you're working for, right? That's the idea of Shabbat. Most people associate Shabbat with the don'ts, whereas you are explicitly told to take pleasure in Shabbat. Take anything that might cause you pleasure without harming others, of course, right? If you like eating, eat. A lot of Jews actually have 4 meals on the Sabbath. On the Sabbath day, there's a breakfast, brunch, lunch, and dinner. Take pleasure in eating. Eat as much as you want. Take pleasure in sleeping. Take pleasure with your family. Go out, enjoy the day and stuff also. This is the greatest pleasure. Without understanding that, without actually appreciating that, why are we even working? And that is the most basic ideas of Shabbat. And this is where I'm going to start building up towards my actual ending point, which is to understand what is the aspiration in the Jewish life. In the Jewish life, the aspiration is the time of Shabbat. People wait for Shabbat throughout the week. They don't dread from it. They don't dread from the time which they cannot do anything. They wait for that moment. At least, real observant Jews, they wait for that moment in which they're not allowed to do these things, because what it does, it sheds away all the nonsense and you can focus on what's important in your life. We can move to the next one if that's all right. I think that point was clear. So the Passover meal, you all know this painting. This is purposefully I chose not the original painting because I didn't want to infringe on any, rights and so forth and so on, especially after Pastor told me that you guys might be suing me for using your picture in my publicity stunt. But we'll see how that works out at the end. So this is a very famous picture of the Passover meal. Of course, it's a ridiculous picture. No offense to anyone who really likes art. I studied art for a while. And between you and me, there's nothing like this. For those of you who came with me to the room of Last Supper, for yourself, the room of Last Supper doesn't have a flat ceiling, for one. It doesn't have all this modernistic aspect of that particular timeline in Europe. Jesus probably did not sit in the center dressed in red and blue. Probably not. He definitely not in a long table that was dressed with a tablecloth and had cutlery and china and all sorts of different things and pieces of food just scattered randomly on the tablecloth. This is not what it looked like. This is a symbolic representation from the eyes of a person that is displaying this in his time, from his perspective. They probably sat on the floor. They probably shared with their hands from the central bowls. They were serving bowls and they took from. Why am I showing you this? Because I want to remind you that ultimately at the end of the day, the Passover meal is the same as the Sabbath meal, right? The same as the Sabbath meal with one main difference. You can't use leavened bread. You have to use unleavened bread. An additional aspect is that you are told to take the story of the Exodus throughout the night. And there are very famous rabbis throughout history that have actually done this, told the story of the Exodus again and again and again, debated and relented and debated and talked about it again and again throughout the night until it was the next morning when they had to go to pray. It's a very important piece. Now, so the Passover meal, if we take the Passover meal and throw on it everything we just said, right? So that would have been the lighting of the candles prior to the beginning of the Passover meal. and there would have been the blessing of the wine prior to the blessing of the bread. And we read in the Gospels and we see that Jesus, in fact, blesses the wine before he blesses the bread, right? There's drink the wine before there's eat the bread. And this is aligned with Jewish tradition, both of today and of the times, just it means something different in that particular moment. May I ask you to move forward, Pastor? We're almost getting to the end, I promise you guys. It's not for a long time. So, AKA the Last Supper, and we skipped one, but that's all right. So let's go the Last Supper instead of the Passover Meal. And if we go with the idea of Oneg Shabbat, right, if you remember the previous one, we said that the greatest pleasure in one's life is your family. So the question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to leave that one open, does Jesus regard the disciples as his family? It's a big question, right? If this is the case, then is this situation, is this climate, is this atmosphere, the Oneg Shabbat, the pleasure of Shabbat that he is trying to introduce into them, or that they're supposed to be enjoying at that particular moment? And if so, is it a bit of a disappointment when it's not what it's supposed to be? This is a very interesting faction of how this would have been understood at the time, and what would the people that would be sharing the table would have had as a symbolic idea of what this is supposed to be. Are the disciples Jesus' family? That's a question I'm going to leave open. Let's move to the next one, if that's all right. You can debate this a little bit later. So futuristic Shabbat. And this is I always start with the past, move to the present, and then to the future. This time I start from the present, move to the past, and then I'm moving to the future, and there's a reason for this. Futuristic Shabbat. What is Shabbat going to look like in the future? What are the ideas associated with Shabbat in a futuristic concept? And how does this relate to where we are in our personal timelines right now, right? May I ask you to move to the next one, sir? Thank you, and I apologize for this.
Good.
So Shabbat for Jews, right? There's a saying in Jewish tradition, more than Israel has kept the Sabbath or the Shabbat has kept Israel. What does it mean? It means basically that more than Jews have gone out of their way to keep the Sabbath has actually guarded the Jews. Why? Because when you have such strict protocol that you're supposed to observe, it sets you apart from anyone else, right? And when you set apart from anyone else, you congregate to be a unit, which has guarded the idea of keeping to your own people and your peoplehood throughout the generations. Look at Judaism. We always talk about Judaism since Abraham's time. That's unrealistic. Abraham was not a Jew. Abraham was a Hebrew. Judaism as a religion is created a little bit before and towards the idea of Mount Sinai. Moses goes out to Mount Sinai, basically after the Jews escape Egypt, gets the commandments and come down from the mountain. He sees Aaron has created the golden calf. And he breaks the commandments and he's utterly destroyed with all this. And he goes up to the mountain and he brings the commandments to it again. That is the beginning point of Judaism. That's when Jews actually start conversing with God as a group, as an entity. That's when we start getting the message. And we say at that particular moment, we will listen, we will do, and we will listen, right? Now, Seven Ishmael, we will do and we will listen. In other words, we'll do first, we won't think. Afterwards, we'll listen to what he actually wants to do. Not necessarily in the right order, but that's what we say. More than Israel has kept the Sabbath has kept Israel. So from a nationalistic perspective, one of the main reasons we have Jews today is the fact that Jews are, one, stubborn to some degree, right? But realistically, very much in line with the old traditions, this in some ways, or in some traditions, and we've definitely been aligned with this tradition. When do we start seeing secular or agnostic Jews? Last 3, 4, 5 generations. Go back 3, 4, 5 generations, there wouldn't have been too many Jews sitting around on Friday Eve willing to record a session to be later on broadcast to the community in the States. I mean, that wouldn't have been the case. 3, 4, 5 generations ago, people wouldn't have not violated the Sabbath so quickly. It would have been part of their lives. It would have been disallowed. And more importantly, they wouldn't have thought of doing this. So that's from a nationalistic perspective. Shabbat has kept the Jews, right? And it's probably going to continue keeping the Jews unless Jews completely disregard this from this point on. That's one. Next one, though, is more important from my perspective. And this is going to build up. So who keeps what, right? The Shabbat the Jews or the Jews the Shabbat? That's the question I've been talking about. There's no reason to do this again. We can move to the next one, and this is going to start building up towards where this is making sense. Messianic expectations. in the Jewish understanding of the world, is the past, the present, but there's always a concept of the future. In this case, Judaism and Christianity is very similar. The difference is that most Jews don't walk around on a daily basis thinking about the Messiah, right? They don't actually celebrate the idea of the Messiah. They don't think about it too much, but Passover of all times is one of those times in the year in which we actually think about it. Why? Because in our Passover meal, we set a place especially for Elijah. By Jewish tradition, Elijah is going to be the one that marks when the Messiah comes from the line of David. So we come to that moment, especially on Passover, many people are going to start discussing the idea of the Messiah from the line of David. Who is the Messiah from the line of David? Has he come yet? Has he not come yet? And so forth, so on. What are we talking about though? Messianic expectations would say that Havdalah is no longer held because Shabbat does not end. You remember the beginning? We talked about the candles. You light the candles at the beginning, and then at the end of the Shabbat, you do this very mournful celebration or mournful ritual in which you light a single candle that has at least 2 wicks that are bound together in a marking, a symbolic marking of the end of the holy times, which is Shabbat, and going back to the mundane, to the regular, to the secular, right? Havdalah is no longer held. Why? Because from Messianic expectation concept, when the Messiah actually comes and it becomes the times of the Messiah or the Messianic age, Shabbat will not end. You remember? We all think of Shabbat as this, or not all, but many people think of Shabbat as a time in which you're not allowed to do things. But the truth is that from a Jewish perspective, it is a time of joy. It is a time of celebration. It is a time in which you don't have to do all that. You can focus on what's actually important. So Havdalah is not held because Shabbat does not come to an end. I ask you to just press it once. Sunday never happens again. Shabbat continues. So if you go through the week, from a Jewish perspective, Sunday is 1, right? Monday's 2, Tuesday's 3, yada, yada, yada. Saturday, which is the Sabbath, is actually 7, right? When the Saturday ends, what is the number you actually go to? You go back to 1, because after the Saturday, after the Sabbath, you go back to Sunday, which is the beginning of the work week from a Jewish perspective. So another Messianic expectation is that Sunday never happens again. Now, don't take offense. I know Sunday is a big day from a Christian perspective. There's not an offense against Christianity. This is just from a Jewish perspective. It has nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. From a Jewish perspective, one of the Messianic expectations would be that as we come to this time in which there's no more famine, there's no more plague, there's no more sick, there's no more dying, there's no more people in distress because the Messiah has fixed everything. It basically comes to a moment in which you don't have to work. We go back to the times of the Garden of Eden, where food was produced for us. The punishment of Adam and Eve would be relieved. Man was punished that he would work by the sweat of his brow, and the woman was punished that she would bear children. That's the punishments that were given in the Bible for basically disobeying God and eating from the forbidden fruit, not listening to what he said to us. And so those punishments are going to be alleviated. We don't have to work. We don't have to create food. It's all given to us. We've come to the Messianic time, so Sunday never happens again. And the last one, if I remember this correctly, instead of after 7 going back to 1, we finally get to 8, right? What is 8? Take the number 8, switch it sideways, and what you get is the symbol of infinity, right? If I may ask you to press the button one last time, Pastor. What you get is infinity. An infinite Shabbat is one of the ideas in the Jewish condition of what is the Messianic times. Now look around you for a second, right? We've been forced to sit at home. We can't go to work. I have been forced to accept unemployment. You know, as a person that runs my own business, that it is difficult for me to appreciate this idea that I have to sit at home. I'm not allowed to work. Not even that I can't. It's not that I don't want to. It's not that I physically cannot. I'm not allowed to go out to work. Why? Because something is going on and I've been told by my government that I'm not allowed to work. And my automatic response is to say, no, I'm going to go out to work no matter what. I have to supply for my family. And so the government comes to me and says, no, don't worry about it. We know that you're unemployed. We understand that. We also know that you run your own business, which means that technically you're not eligible for unemployment. But you know what? We're going to give you unemployment nonetheless. There you go. Here's money. Spend it whatever you need. You need food, go buy food, right? You want to have Netflix, pay for Netflix. You want internet, do internet, whatever you want. Do whatever you want with your family. Have as much food as you like, because this is more than you need, realistically speaking. And enjoy it. They're not saying enjoy it. Nobody is thinking enjoy it, because we're all continuously focusing on the idea that I was forced to sit at home. This is a horrible moment for me. I hate every second of it. But realistically speaking, we've been gifted with one of the biggest gifts ever. We've been forced to stop and enjoy a continuous moment of peace and Shabbat. Now, I know this is not necessarily how people are seeing it right now, but from a Jewish perspective, many would say, this is peculiar. It almost feels like we've arrived at the Messianic times ahead of time. It's almost like a loophole. We almost skipped ahead on the whole situation. The Messiah didn't come from a Jewish perspective, right? Or Jesus did not return yet, if you will. But we are all of a sudden in this particular moment in which we don't have to work. We're being provided with food, from my perspective, at least where I'm sitting. And, I get to enjoy my kids. So, and my wife, of course, and my house and everything I've built for it. And I barbecue in the yard because it's actually sunny here in Israel. I don't know what you're experiencing. And everything comes with it, It's a continuous Shabbat. At the end of the day, I think what my point in all of this is, I started with what is Shabbat, or we started with what is Shabbat. Because technically speaking, right now in Israel is a Friday evening, which means that we started the Shabbat a few hours ago in my country. Right now, we're already within this process of Shabbat. I've been talking about the idea of Shabbat, what you do on Shabbat, so forth, so on. And I've actually been experiencing a continuous Shabbat for the last 3 weeks or more, on my perspective. And most of us don't realize it that way. And I think it is a moment in which one has to stop and realize and be grateful and thankful for the blessings we're given, because this is a blessing in disguise. We're told to stay at home because there's a virus somewhere, right? But what I got out of all this, I got to sit here with my girls, and I'm going to share with you something. And I don't normally share from my personal life. And, those who have been to Israel can attest to that. I don't normally share from my life. But I have twins. They're 3.5 years old. One of them came up to me a week and a half ago, and she says to me in her own words, this is a 3.5-year-old, she says, Dad, before you weren't living with us, now you are living with us. 5.5 years, 6 years I've been in this industry, tourism industry. I've been out of the house for so long. And even now in this situation, until a month ago, I was most of the time out of the house. And all of a sudden, in her own words, she says, until very recently, you weren't living with us. From her perspective, I'm finally living with her, And it really shook me. But then I understood what she meant. This is a gift. I was given a gift, and I appreciate it and really treasure it for what it is. And that's what I wanted to share with you. And if I can ask you to press the button one last time, keep saying one last time, whatever button you press is going to move forward. What does Shabbat have to do with Jesus' miracles? All right, that's a question that we're going to leave unanswered for maybe potentially a next session, if you wish it. And the words of Theodor Herzl, if you wish it, it will come. So that's what I leave you with. What does Shabbat have to do with Jesus? Miracles, for those of you trying to squint at the screen to see what I wrote there, I wrote hints, Bethesda. And for those who've been to Israel, I promise you that I've already given you the answer when we visited the site of Bethesda. If you don't remember it, that's all right. Pastor, I'm asking you to one last time press that button. Promise you that's the last one. Tune in for our next session and find out, or go do some actual self-studying, because we really do have the time right now. So that's from me to you.
So one question that I have for you is regarding, you talk about work. I think most of us get that, but the element that we don't always talk a lot about, but I think is a huge thing in American culture, is the idea of leisure, exercise, sports. And so, even if people do consider take a Sabbath, it's very active, playing tennis or biking or, watching television or watching sports. Can you just give a brief answer to sort of speak into that element of if that's something that would give people pleasure? So is it acceptable or not acceptable? When I was in Bible college, we could not watch television. We could not play sports. We could not do anything. We were basically expected just to do nothing but read, and we couldn't do homework. Just stay in your room and basically do nothing except, pray. So can you speak into that element a little bit?
I understand what you're saying, but I think what we have to take into consideration is that the fact that today's traditions are affected by biblical interpretations made by the rabbinical movement over time. So, between you and me, and I'm seriously hoping I'm not offensive to anyone, right? But 2,000 years ago, there was not a single car driving around. So, I mean, you couldn't tell people don't go drive around, right? Because there weren't cars, so they're not driving. And if you remember the 39 occupations that were forbidden, horseback riding was not mentioned. You could ride a horse. Most people wouldn't. Why wouldn't they ride a horse? Because it would be associated with plowing. So it would be understood as plowing your field, right? Because you normally rode your horse or carried stuff in order to do some sort of function. So just to be clear, so you don't miscommunicate what you're doing, people would refrain from doing these things so that they're clear, so they don't accidentally plow their field because the horse might be dragging something behind stuff or so. Over time, the rabbinical interpretation builds up to the fact that, we refrain from a lot of different things that did not exist in the old world. TV, for that respect, did not exist in the old world. There was no TV. Were you allowed to read? Absolutely. Were you allowed to write? Absolutely not. And there's even a mentioning of Jesus teaching on the Temple Mount in which he writes in the sand with a stick. He refrains from writing with a pen. So this whole idea of what is allowed 2,000 years ago versus what is allowed today. Today, we are dealing with a lot of biblical interpretations. There's absolutely nothing that says that you're not allowed to start your car on Shabbat. It has to do with a motorized engine, gasoline engine, right? That you turn the key in the switch, it creates a spark in the engine. And by creating a spark in the engine, actually start the engine. So technically you're starting a fire, which you're not allowed to do, right? It actually says that very clearly. But with electric cars today, you press a button, the fire happens. I mean, there's no fire. So technically speaking, there's no disallowance. So first of all, it's a matter of understanding what is really the biblical teaching and what is interpretation. And going back to what you said, you can go out and play soccer technically on Shabbat, and many people do. You can go hiking. There are limitations that were placed over time to make sure that you don't accidentally break the code. So if you remember, Jesus heals the lame at Bethesda, and then the lame, he says to the lame, carry your mat with you, right? Take your mat with you, go. And he goes with his mat to the Temple Mount, and at the Temple Mount, the entrance to the Temple Mount, the guards stop him and say, wait, don't you know you're not supposed to carry the mat on Shabbat? Right? Because he's carrying something. Carrying something might be interpreted as work. That's what's offensive to them, right? Not the fact that he's walking around, but the fact that he's carrying something. So technically speaking, you can go hiking on Shabbat, no problem whatsoever, as long as you don't carry things. As long as it's not, mistakenly understood as work. When you go a lot of times through, in your case, Bible studies or Bible, seminary stuff of the sort, they try to adapt to the teachings of the Jewish tradition today so that you would experience what it is Shabbat, to have Shabbat from a Jewish perspective based on today's tradition. But that is not necessarily the case. You need to look at Shabbat from a historical standpoint. What was allowed, disallowed 3,000 years ago, and then experience the Shabbat of that time. Because what we really want to do is basically understand Judaism of the text that we're reading about. And the text we're reading about in the Gospels is the first century. So we really shouldn't compare Shabbat today with what happened 2,000 years ago, because that's going to throw us off a bit. So watching a ball game, technically speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. Going out to hike, there's nothing wrong with that. Driving your car to a ball game, nothing wrong with that. But the biblical interpretation, I've added all sorts of different additions so that they would limit what you're doing. So that's today's understanding. It has nothing to do with realistic Shabbat.
Great. So one question. You sort of, you things went pretty smooth, but you did have a glitch. You sort of locked up, at least on my computer, when we were talking about the Shabbat for a lifetime, and you were talking about the candles, and you made a comment about if I can throw somebody under the bus, and you sort of glitched for about 10 or 15 seconds there. So can you repeat what you were saying there?
Maybe that was meant to be, right? Maybe I'm not supposed to throw that person on the bus. So Michelle from the group sent me a question about they wanted to conduct a symbolic, I guess, Passover in their household. And they had a question about how to do this. And I failed to answer them on time. So I answered them only the next day. And I said, you can do it when we do it, or you can do it the next day. It doesn't really matter, as long as if you wanted to do symbolic Passover, technically speaking, you can do it the next day in the States, and it's perfectly fine. And so they did it. And she sent me pictures. She actually uploaded pictures to Facebook. And I saw pictures of her family doing Passover in the household. And one of the things they did, if I remember this correctly, is they actually lit the candles before Passover started. So I could be wrong, and I could be just making this up in my head, but that's what I remember seeing. So I mentioned that they followed the traditions of Passover, and they actually lit the candles before Passover started in their household. So that's what I said. But realistically, you would light the candle way before the sun sets, just to make sure you didn't violate it by mistake. And so what it translates into really is the fact that when you show up at 7 p.m. in somebody's house and currently outside my house is pitch black, everything is already going to be done in respect to the candles. Everything else you can do whenever, but the candles mark the beginning of Shabbat, so they should be done before the Shabbat starts. And the ceremony of the lighting of the candle, which is called Havdalah, which distinguishes between holiness and mundane, that is done at the end of Shabbat, needs to be done at least an hour after the Sabbath has ended, to make sure that you don't do it during the Shabbat. So you never light fire during the Shabbat. It's always before and after, which is why the Sabbath isn't, for most people, the Sabbath isn't actually 24 hours. It's more like 25 hours, because you take a little bit of time before and a little bit of time after, just to make sure you're on the safe side. And that's why people didn't see the candles when we went into the people's homes. But the candles are a very important aspect of Shabbat.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing, Shai. You know, the big takeaway for me is that, is this idea of just the spirit of this, as it wasn't in the biblical days, and as it relates to our current situation, I thought was pretty interesting. So, Shai, thank you very much for sharing with us. Appreciate everybody being here. We can take a few, if you want to maybe type in the chat a couple questions, we can do that briefly, but we only got a couple more minutes here before we wrap up. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks everybody for sitting in. And if you have a couple questions, you can try to type those in. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up here.
As people are starting to type in, let me just say that thank you for having me. Seriously, this is wonderful to do this. This is the first one of its kind with this group. I'm hoping that there might be more, but that's not the point. The point is that it's just fun to see faces that I've seen in Israel and actually continue this relationship. And I wish upon you a very blessed Shabbat that would continue until it runs its course in its natural way, and that we would just, be able to focus on what's important and just enjoy the situation that we're forced into by not focusing on what we have to do or not do, but just taking the fact that we can appreciate what we get. And so that's my blessing in a way, or my hope for the future. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If not, then it's all good.
And for everybody else, wish you have a good, happy Friday, and I hope and pray that we have a good reflective weekend. This obviously is a very unique Easter for each of us this year, not being able to meet or to have our normal traditions and practices, whether it's Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, or Easter Sunday. But we know the Lord is with us, and I pray each of you draw near to him this weekend and have a very meaningful time, though different, yet still powerful and meaningful. So all that being said, let me pray for us, and then we will wrap up. Father, I thank you for our friend Shai. I pray, Lord, that you bless he and his family during this time, and all of our friends there in Israel. We pray, Lord, for those of us here in the States during this very unique season of history that we're living through. Help us, dear God, to draw near to you. We thank you on this Good Friday as we remember the death of Christ for the forgiveness of our sins, and as we prepare for Easter Sunday to remember the resurrection and the coming of your kingdom. We thank you, and we pray that you would continue to work in our lives and through your church during this very incredible time. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Shai. I'll connect with you after the meeting here, and thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.